So now let's do the second part where we add some data to our class. I'll go ahead and put that here. Okay, and so for example, what cars need to be able to do is, let's say, capture their mileage. So I'm going to call something mileage, like so. And by convention, a lot of times if a field is inside of a class and is private, we put an underscore in front of it. I'm going to use that convention here. It's a fairly old convention. Not everybody uses it. It's just kind of a nice marker for us. All right, so anyway, that's a field. Okay, and of course fields need data types. That's why I'm getting that syntax message there. So the data type is int. We're going to decide that for whatever reason, for mileage for our car, it's always an integer value. It never has fractional parts of miles. Okay, and then we have to decide upon an access specifier. Okay, so again, our two access specifiers that we're aware of right now are public and private. There's a couple of others, but we will talk about those in a later lecture. For now, let's go ahead and say that this is private. Okay, so that's a field, and in fact, it's a private field. And what does private mean in this instance? What it means is that this piece of data cannot be accessed outside of the class in which it's declared. So in other words, this is it's a variable in that you can store information, but this variable, or the data associated with mileage, is at this point not available inside of your class car. Or I'm sorry, inside of your method main, or inside of, in this case, your class program. Okay. And that's pretty common, and in fact, virtually all fields will be marked as private. Okay. So now what I can do is I can go into Drive, and I can do something like underscore mileage equals, and then, so the standard drive amount, let's say, is 100 miles. So I'll set that equal to 100 every time you call drive. Then we decide that this data here, we want to keep it safe, so we say that it's private, but we do want to be able to access information like that from outside user code, right? Which is to say code that makes use of this class. So how can we do that? Well, let's see. Let's do the simplest thing. Let's make this public. Okay. And then we go back to program, and we could say something like write out Pinto dot, and there you see something called underscore mileage. So I'm going to select that. And let's do something like I've driven that number of miles, whatever that might be. Okay, so I'll use an output statement like this. If you put the $sign there, remember it means that you can put variables inside of your format specifier string. All right, so then we go ahead and run this code. And we see that I'm driving, which is our message to ourselves, so to speak, that we've called in drive. And at this point, we've driven 100. I forgot to put miles on it. So let's fix that up. So finish that, and then just say, I've driven 100 miles, period. So that's what it would look like if you had a field that was public. So going back here, I've got this public field, and so I got to, I'll change my comment here just so we can sort of keep track of it. All right, but let's consider what this is going to mean to make that a public field. So I'll go back to program here, and what I can do is I can say Pinto dot underscore mileage equals, let's say 50. Okay, and I'll copy this output statement down to here and run the code again. And as we look at it, okay, I'm driving, good. I've driven 100 miles, okay, great. And then it says I've driven 50 miles. And now think about this in the real world. Are you allowed to set your odometer back? It actually turns out to be a federal crime. You're not allowed to go to a car and make it look like it has fewer mileages or fewer miles on it than it actually has. So what I've done here essentially is to corrupt my object. In this case, the object is Pinto. and I've done something that should be against the rules of a car, and as I say, in the real world, it is actually illegal. All right, so how can I represent that in code? Well, what I can do is I go back to car, and I can say, instead of making that public, make it private, as we indicated before, it probably should be. Okay, so great. So now I've got a field that's private, and so that's good. I've got a method drive that sets my mileage and gives some sort of indication that driving is taking place. If you go back to main at this point, however, these lines no longer work. Okay, so this is the situation that we have. We have some data that we would like people on the outside to know. In other words, think of, again, a real car. You are allowed to look at the odometer and see how much mileage is on the car. What you're not allowed to do is reduce that number of miles. So I want some level of visibility for my data, but I don't want it to be completely available. So what can we do? And the answer to that is we can create what's known as a property. All right, so let me just, I guess I marked these here, so let's go ahead and put this here. Of course, you wouldn't typically have this many of these sorts of comments in your regular code once you get used to it. So I've got a field, I've got a method, and now I want to create a property. And a property is sort of a hybrid between a method and a field. Okay. So let's do an example, and we'll call this thing odometer. So odometer. All right, and just like everything in a C family language situation, I've got to give this some sort of a type associated with it. And since mileage is in integer, it makes sense that odometer might be an integer. So I'll do something like int. All right, and then before that, of course, I need my access specifier. So fields are generally, if not universally, private. Methods are often public, although it's perfectly reasonable, and you will see times when you will have private methods. In this case, we don't need one. So that leaves us with properties. Properties are often public. Again, if you left that out, if you left the access specifier out, it would be private. Because that's the default, but as I said before, don't let the default stand. All right, so at this point, it kind of looks like a field, right? Public int odometer, public int mileage, right? These sort of have the same form to them. Where it's different is that there's a block statement after your property. And now we can tell that it's a property. And again, you can tell that it is a property because it has a field, and it's not a method because it doesn't have a set of parentheses. So public int odometer, and properties have two parts. They have a get part, and they have a set part. Okay, we're going to add some code into that in a little bit, but for right now, the get part is the part that allows you to return the value of that property. So let's do an example of that before we actually add any code. So we'll go back to program, and of course these don't work anymore, so we're going to comment those messages out until we have solved our property problem. Okay, and now let's see what we have available to us. We have Pinto dot, and as you can see, we have a new thing here called odometer. So you can kind of tell, let's bring that back. You can kind of tell what's what because the methods have little purple boxes, as you can see there, and properties have a wrench because apparently properties are supposed to be a tool. It's a wrench anyway. That means it's a property. And you may recall you can actually see those symbols back there in the object browser. They use exactly the same set. All right, so at any rate, one of them's odometer, so I'm going to select that. And back up here. All right, and there are two possibilities for a piece of data in terms of, let's say, the equal sign. You can say pinto.odometer equals, which means you're setting the value. So let's just put an arbitrary value in there. So this uses the set code. All right, because what I'm doing is I'm saying this thing right here goes into odometer somehow. So if we go back to car, that's this part of it. So the reverse of that, the get part, is just its value. And so, for example, if you wanted to say write out pinto.odometer, so this uses the get code. All right, so in other words, when the value of odometer it needs to be brought up, the code that's being called in terms of odometer and that property, the code that's being called would be this code right here. And so the question then becomes, what code do you want to present to the user of your code when they use the get portion of odometer? And in this case, what I want to do is I want to return the value of mileage, because that's basically what an odometer does. All right. So to complete the example, I will go ahead and consider what the set code might look like. So again, going back to main, this is an example that would use the set code. This is where you're taking a value and you want to place it into odometer. All right. So in this case, the value 5 would be placed in there. So what does that code look like? Well, what we want to do is we want to store the value passed to us into this mileage field. And so underscore mileage equals, and then the question is, what's on the right-hand side? In other words, if I go back to main, this thing right here, this 5, that's my right-hand side of my assignment statement. So how do I refer to that in my property code? And the answer is there's a special keyword whose job it is to grab that, and it's value. And you can see it's a keyword because it turns blue. So what's on the right-hand side? Value, or the keyword value. Okay. So that will allow you full access in your odometer to be able to read the value out. So get is, if you like, a read, and to set the value or to write the value. Not in terms of I/O, but just in terms of the data itself. All right, so going back to main here, as we look at this, again, we don't want this sort of thing to be allowed. We don't want that to happen. So how do we code our property in such a way that this isn't allowed? And the answer is, you don't have to have a set part. So I could actually get rid of this. Or alternatively, I could keep that in case for whatever reason I want to have a set part, but not available on the outside. I could make it private. Okay, so those are your two choices. You could say private, which means only methods inside of the class can actually call this the set part of odometer. Or, as I said, if you don't want it to be modified at all, you can just delete that part. And so now if we go back to main, you will see, of course, that this is not legal, and that's what we want. We want it to be impossible to modify the odometer. That should be done by the car itself. Just a sort of review there. We've got actions, which are methods, and so far we have drive. Not too interesting, but nonetheless it does do something. We have storage, which are fields, and for that we have mileage, but we don't want full access to that, so we make it private. And then properties, which, as I said, are a hybrid between methods and fields. That's the thing that allows us to get some access on the outside, but a limited set of access.